The engineering office smelled of blueprint paper and Dutch confidence. Amsterdam, Netherlands. A water management consultancy on the fourth floor of a canal-side building where the walls were covered in flood barrier schematics and the air carried the specific certainty of a country that had spent 500 years arguing with the sea and winning. The Dutch water engineer, 34 years in flood management, lead designer on 3 of the Netherlands' most celebrated Delta infrastructure projects, a man who had been consulted by the governments of Bangladesh, Vietnam, and New Orleans after Katrina, and whose professional reputation rested on the absolute conviction that water could be controlled if you understood it precisely enough and built precisely enough in response, sat across the table from the Filipino environmental engineer and looked at the photographs of traditional Filipino flood management communities with the expression of a man who has spent his career building walls and has just been shown a photograph of people who simply learned to float. He picked up the first photograph, set it down, picked up the second. His mouth made a small movement that was not quite a smile, the specific micro-expression of someone encountering something they find more charming than credible. He set the second photograph down beside the first and said, in the careful, measured English of a Dutch professional who considers precision a moral virtue, "These communities are not managing flood, they are accommodating it. There is a fundamental difference between a system and an adaptation. What I am looking at is adaptation. Impressive adaptation, certainly, but there is no engineering here. This is survival that has learned to look like strategy." He aligned the photographs with the edge of the table, the gesture of a man who keeps things orderly even when dismissing them. 8 months later, he would be standing in the ruins of a Pampanga community after Typhoon Queenie, the same typhoon that had tested Apo Lakay's bamboo structure in Benguet, watching the floodwaters recede around a network of traditional Filipino water management structures that had not only survived Category 5 conditions, but had directed the floodwater away from the community's inhabited areas with a precision that his 34 years of flood management engineering could not immediately explain and could not stop being astonished by. Welcome to Archipelago Archive. Subscribe now to join our mission of documenting the legends the world ignored. The year was 2022. The location, Amsterdam, Netherlands, a city built on water, a country defined by its relationship with water, a civilization whose entire existence is a testament to the human capacity to manage, redirect, contain, and ultimately coexist with forces of nature that most of the world simply endures. The Netherlands sits below sea level. This is not a metaphor. Significant portions of the country only exist because Dutch engineering has been arguing with the North Sea for 5 centuries and has, through a combination of extraordinary technical innovation, relentless infrastructure investment, and the specific cultural conviction that water is a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted, been winning that argument long enough to build a civilization on the reclaimed ground. In the Netherlands, water management is not a technical specialty. It is a national identity. It is what the Dutch do and who the Dutch are, and why the Dutch are consulted by every other nation on earth when the floods come. The Dutch water engineer had spent 34 years at the absolute frontier of this identity. He had studied at Delft University of Technology, the institution that produces more water management engineers per capita than any other in the world. He had worked on the Maaslandkering, the enormous storm surge barrier that protects Rotterdam. He had consulted on the Room for the River program, the landmark Dutch initiative that had literally relocated communities and reshaped floodplains to give Dutch rivers more space. He had been flown to New Orleans in the aftermath of Katrina, and to Vietnam before the monsoon season, and to Vietnam when the Mekong Delta began losing its battle with sea level rise. He was, by any measurable standard, one of the finest flood management engineering minds of his generation,
and he had arrived at the conviction through 34 years of field experience across 4 continents that the fundamental principle of serious flood management was control. You understood the water, you modeled the water, you built infrastructure to redirect the water, you won. The Filipino environmental engineer who had requested the Amsterdam meeting was a woman named Tala, 37 years old, a hydraulic engineer and indigenous water systems specialist who had spent 12 years studying the traditional flood management practices of communities in Central Luzon, specifically in the low-lying agricultural areas of Pampanga and Bulacan that experienced significant flooding every typhoon season and had been managing that flooding with extraordinary community resilience through a combination of traditional engineering knowledge and indigenous water management philosophy that predated the Dutch water management tradition by at least 1,000 years. She had published 4 papers on these systems. She had presented at 2 international flood management conferences. She had been, each time, received with polite professional interest that the international engineering community extended to traditional knowledge systems, which is to say, acknowledged, categorized as culturally interesting, and then set aside in favor of the quantitative models. She had requested the Amsterdam meeting specifically because of Typhoon Queenie, the Category 5 system that had arrived 8 months after the Dutch water engineers' dismissal, and had tested every flood management system in Central Luzon with a force that no engineer, Dutch or Filipino, had designed for. She had been in the field throughout the storm and its aftermath. She had her data, and her data showed something that she believed no amount of conference presentations would be able to communicate as effectively as standing in a Pampanga community with a Dutch water engineer and letting him look at what the typhoon had left standing and what it had taken, and asking him to explain the difference. In a community of stilt houses on the edge of a river in Pampanga, houses that had been standing on their wooden stilts above the floodwater for generations, organized around a network of traditional drainage channels and bamboo water diversion structures that the community called their Baja system, an elder named Tatay Gorio, 71 years old, the keeper of the community's water management knowledge, the man who had supervised the annual pre-typhoon maintenance of the drainage channels and the bamboo diversion structures for 42 years, heard through his daughter that a Dutch water engineer was coming to look at what the typhoon had left standing. He walked to the edge of the community and looked at the river. Then he looked at the channels. Then he looked at the houses on their stilts, standing exactly where they had always stood, exactly as they had always stood, the floodwater having done exactly what the channels and the structures and the stilts had been designed for generations to ensure it did. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Sige, hayaan ni tingnan niya." Fine, let him look.
To understand what the Dutch water engineer was about to see in Pampanga, you have to understand what Filipino traditional flood management actually is, not the accommodation that his Amsterdam assessment had categorized it as, not the impressive adaptation that his professional framework had found charming but not credible, but the specific, sophisticated, deliberately designed water management system that communities in Central Luzon had been refining for 1,000 years in direct, daily, seasonal, and catastrophic conversation with the flood behavior of the Pampanga River and its tributaries, a conversation that had produced, through 1,000 years of empirical refinement, a system of extraordinary practical intelligence. The foundation of the system is the understanding that water in a flood condition is not an enemy to be stopped. It is a force to be redirected. The Dutch water management tradition, built on reclamation, on barriers, on the fundamental principle of keeping water out, had arrived at a version of this understanding in its Room for the River program, a landmark innovation that the Dutch engineering community had celebrated as a paradigm shift. The Filipino communities of Pampanga had been operating on this principle for 1,000 years, not as a paradigm shift, as the starting point.
The Baja system, the network of drainage channels, bamboo diversion structures, elevated house platforms, and community-organized water routing protocols, was not designed to prevent flooding. It was designed to direct flooding, to ensure that when the Pampanga River rose, as it rose every typhoon season and had been rising every typhoon season for 1,000 years, the water went where the community had decided it should go, rather than where gravity alone would take it. If you believe in the untapped power of the Philippines, hit that subscribe button. It helps us find more stories like this one. Tatay Gorio's grandfather had been the keeper of the Baja system before his father and his father before him, a lineage of water knowledge stewardship that Tatay Gorio traced back 7 generations through the community's oral history. The philosophy that governed the system had a name: Daloy and Gabay, flow and guidance. It was not a philosophy of control, it was a philosophy of partnership, the understanding that water in flood condition had its own logic, its own preferred paths, its own momentum, and that the intelligent response to flood was not to oppose that logic, but to understand it deeply enough to guide it. The bamboo diversion structures were not barriers, they were guides, placed at specific locations in the floodplain where the water's own momentum would carry it into the community's pre-designed drainage channels rather than into the community's living spaces. The stilted houses were not emergency measures, they were permanent architectural acknowledgement that the river rose every year and that the appropriate response to an annual event was not constant expensive infrastructure, but permanent elegant accommodation. Dr. Tala had spent 12 years mapping this system with the rigor of a hydraulic engineer and the respect of someone who understood that the system's sophistication exceeded what any single research framework could capture. She had developed a documentation methodology she called Basa and Gabay, reading and guiding, the principle that the traditional system could only be properly understood by someone who had first learned to read the flood behavior of the specific river system the way the community read it, not through modeling software, but through the accumulated observational knowledge of generations of people who had watched the same river rise in the same floodplain season after season for 1,000 years, and had built their management system on that specific, intimate, irreplaceable knowledge. When Typhoon Queenie arrived 8 months after the Amsterdam meeting, Dr. Tala was in Pampanga. She watched the Baja system perform under conditions that no engineering test could have replicated. Category 5 typhoon rainfall, river flow rates that exceeded every seasonal record, flood depths that the community's elders said they had never seen in living memory. She watched the bamboo diversion structures guide the extraordinary water volumes into the pre-designed drainage channels. She watched the stilted houses stand above the floodwater exactly as they had been designed to stand. She watched the community's inhabited areas emerge from the typhoon with flooding damage confined to exactly the areas the Baja system had always directed flooding toward, the agricultural buffer zones that the community maintained precisely for this purpose. And she pulled out her instruments and began collecting the data that she would bring to Pampanga 8 months later with a Dutch water engineer in tow, and let the typhoon's report cards speak for themselves. The Dutch water engineer arrived in Manila on a Tuesday and traveled by road to Pampanga with Dr. Tala and her research team. The post-typhoon landscape they drove through told a story that his instruments had not yet been deployed to read, but that his 34 years of field experience in flood-affected environments immediately began to interpret. He was accustomed to reading post-flood landscapes, the specific patterns of debris distribution that revealed water flow paths, the differential damage patterns that showed where flood management systems had succeeded and where they had failed, the visual evidence of water behavior under extreme conditions that a trained eye could read like a text. He read the Pampanga post-typhoon landscape with professional thoroughness from the vehicle window. And what he read, as they approached the community, was a pattern that did not immediately fit the models he carried in his professional memory. The flood damage visible in the surrounding landscape was significant and consistent. The typhoon had been a Category 5 event, and it showed. But as they entered the community's immediate area, the damage pattern changed in a way that his professional reading of the landscape could not immediately explain. The inhabited areas of the stilt house community showed flood evidence: the watermarks on the wooden stilts, the debris lines, the residual mud on the ground surfaces. But they showed it in a way that was different from the surrounding damage. The water had been here. The water had risen to significant depths, but the water had not remained here. It had moved through channels that were visible now that the flood had receded, their function revealed by the differential debris patterns that showed where the fast-moving water had been routed and where the slow pooling water had been directed.
He got out of the vehicle at the community edge and stood looking at the channel system for a long time without speaking. Dr. Tala stood beside him. Tatay Garillo stood nearby, patient, unhurried, watching the Dutch engineer read what the typhoon had left with the expression of someone watching a visitor read a text in a language they are only beginning to understand. The formal assessment took 4 days. The Dutch engineer's team, a hydrologist and a structural engineer who had accompanied him from Amsterdam, measured, mapped, modeled, and analyzed every element of the Baja system with the systematic thoroughness of Dutch flood engineering practice. They ran the typhoon's rainfall and river flow data through their modeling software against the community's drainage channel geometry and bamboo diversion structure placement. They produced a computational fluid dynamics analysis of the water routing that the Baja system had performed during Typhoon Queenie. The results of that analysis produced a document that the Dutch engineer read 3 times before calling Dr. Tala into the assessment room. The analysis showed that the Baja system's bamboo diversion structures, placed at specific locations in the floodplain by Tatay Garillo and his predecessors based on 7 generations of observational knowledge of this specific river's specific flood behavior, were positioned with a precision that the computational model identified as close to optimal for directing the Queenie flood event's water volumes into the community's drainage channels. Not approximately optimal, the same descriptor that had appeared in the Ifugao water chemistry analysis, close to optimal, achieved not through computational modeling, but through 7 generations of watching the same river rise in the same floodplain and learning through observation and practice and the specific oral transmission of accumulated knowledge that Tatay Garillo called Daloy at Gabay, exactly where the water wanted to go when it rose and exactly where to guide it when it did. But what Tatay Garillo showed the Dutch engineer on the 4th morning, walking him to a specific location in the community's Baja channel system that was not visible from any of the assessment positions the engineering team had occupied, was the moment that the computational model's precision findings stopped being impressive data and became something the Dutch engineer would spend 8 months trying to describe in a language adequate to what he was seeing. Stay with me. Because what a man who designed the muslin carrying says when a 71-year-old Filipino elder shows him a bamboo water diversion structure that 1,000 years of flood observation has placed within meters of where his modeling software would have placed it, tells you everything about what the Baja system has always known and everything about what 5 centuries of Dutch water management has been slowly and expensively arriving at. The location Tatay Garillo led the Dutch engineer to on the 4th morning was a specific junction in the Baja channel system, a point where 3 of the community's primary drainage channels converged before directing their combined water volume into the agricultural buffer zone that absorbed the overflow of every significant flood event. It was, hydraulically speaking, the most critical point in the entire system, the junction where the success or failure of the water routing depended on the precise geometry of the channel angles and the precise placement of the bamboo guide structures that directed each channel's water volume into the correct downstream path. Tatay Garillo had rebuilt this junction after every major flood event for 42 years. Not restored, rebuilt. The bamboo structures were not permanent infrastructure. They were renewed annually, their placement adjusted based on the previous season's flood observations, their geometry refined by 42 years of watching what the water did when it arrived at this specific location in flood condition, and learning, iteration by iteration, how to guide it better. The Dutch engineer's computational model had identified this junction as the key hydraulic node of the system. It had recommended, based on optimal fluid dynamics, a specific configuration of channel angles and guide structure placement that would maximize the system's flood routing efficiency under Queenie scale conditions. Tatai-Garillo's rebuilt junction was within 2 meters of the model's recommendation, in a system spanning several hectares, arrived at through 42 years of empirical observation rather than computational fluid dynamics. The Dutch engineer stood at the junction for a long time. His hydrologist stood beside him. Neither spoke. Then the Dutch engineer took out his field notebook and wrote something. He showed it to his hydrologist. His hydrologist read it and nodded. The Dutch engineer showed it to Dr. Tala. She read it. She looked at Tatai-Garillo. She translated it. Tatai-Garillo listened. Then he nodded once. The same single nod that appears in every story in this archive, the specific nod of a Filipino elder who has been told something true about their work and receives it without needing it. What the Dutch engineer had written in his field notebook was, "The model and the elder agree. I am no longer certain which one is validating the other." He spent the rest of the 4th day and a 5th day that was not in the original protocol, walking the entire Baja system with Tatai-Garillo, asking questions through Dr. Tala's translation. Not assessment questions, understanding questions. How did his grandfather know where to place the first guide structure? He watched the river for 3 seasons before placing anything. How does Tatai-Garillo know when the pre-typhoon maintenance is complete? When the water tells him it is. When the test flow through the channels moves the way it moved the season his father called it complete. How many times has the community's inhabited area been significantly flood damaged in living memory? Tatai-Garillo thought for a moment. Then, dalawang beses, sa dalawang bagyo na hindi namin nakita nagtaming. Twice, in 2 typhoons we did not see coming. The Dutch engineer wrote this down. Then he wrote, "In 34 years of professional flood management, I have not achieved a comparable record with infrastructure costing 100 times more." When the assessment was complete, the Dutch engineer sat with Dr. Tala in the community's covered meeting area and said something that she later quoted in her keynote address at the International Conference on Climate Adaptation and Flood Resilience in Rotterdam, where the Dutch Water Engineering Institute had invited her to present the Pampanga research. He said, "I told you in Amsterdam that what you were showing me was adaptation rather than engineering. I was applying the wrong taxonomy. What I have spent 4 days assessing is not adaptation, it is engineering. It is engineering that my tradition has not yet had the specific 1,000-year conversation with this specific river that your community's tradition has had. And the engineering that emerges from a 1,000-year conversation with a specific river is, in measurable ways, better than the engineering that emerges from 34 years of general flood management expertise applied to a new river system." There is a concept at the heart of Filipino traditional flood management that has no direct translation in any Dutch hydraulic engineering manual. It is called Kaibigan ng Tubig, friend of the water. Not master of the water, not controller of the water, friend. The understanding that water in a flood condition is not an adversary to be defeated, but a force to be known, intimately, specifically, generationally, well enough that when it rises, as it always rises, you know where it wants to go, and you have spent 1,000 years preparing the ground to receive it gracefully. The Dutch water management tradition had arrived at a version of this understanding after 5 centuries of building walls, and then, in the Room for the River program, deciding that perhaps some of those walls should come down. The Pampanga communities had never built the walls in the first place. They had started with the friendship and built everything else from there. The Dutch water engineer returned to Amsterdam 6 weeks after Pampanga.
he submitted a joint research paper with Dr. Tala to the journal Nature Water 4 months later. The paper, co-authored by Dr. Tala and formally crediting Tatay Gorio's 42-year empirical maintenance record as a primary data source, documented the computational fluid dynamics analysis of the Baha system, the comparative performance data from Typhoon Queenie, and a formal theoretical framework for understanding Filipino traditional water management as what the paper called empirical hydrological wisdom systems, knowledge systems that had arrived, through thousand-year empirical refinement, to flood management solutions that computational modeling was only recently developing the sophistication to confirm, and that conventional engineering approaches were only recently developing the philosophical framework to respect. The paper was published. It was cited 47 times in its first year. It was referenced in a Dutch government policy document on international flood management cooperation. The Dutch Water Institute, the Netherlands' premier water management research institution, invited Dr. Tala to present at their annual conference. She presented the Pampanga Baha system to an auditorium of Dutch water engineers with the specific, composed authority of someone who has spent 12 years knowing something important and has finally been given a room large enough to say it in. The Dutch water engineer sat in the front row. When she finished, he was the first to stand. Tatay Gorio heard about the nature water citation from his daughter. He listened to the explanation of what the Dutch Water Institute was and why being cited there mattered in the international water management community. He nodded once, then he went to check the pre-season maintenance of the northern drainage channel. The typhoon season was approaching. The Baha system needed to be ready. It had been ready every season for 1,000 years. It would be ready again. The Dutch water engineer made 2 more visits to Pampanga in the 3 years following the publication. On his second visit, he brought 4 of his Dutch colleagues, senior engineers from Delft and from the water management ministries, and watched them go through the same progression he had gone through. The professional skepticism arriving at the community, the assessment data arriving at the model confirmation, and the final standing at Tatay Gorio's junction at the convergence of 3 drainage channels, watching a 71-year-old Filipino elder rebuild a bamboo water diversion structure and placing it, by eye, by memory, by 42 years of watching the same water move through the same floodplain, within meters of where the most sophisticated computational fluid dynamics software in the world had recommended it be placed. On his third visit, he came alone. He brought no instruments. He spent a week walking the river with Tatay Gorio every morning, learning to read the river's color, learning to read the debris patterns. He learned, slowly, imperfectly, with the humility of someone who has spent 34 years being the most expert person in the room and is now being the least, to have the conversation with a river that Tatay Gorio had been having for 42 years and that the Pampanga community had been having for 1,000. He was, he wrote in his personal journal on the last morning, not yet a friend of the water, but for the first time in 34 years of flood management, he was beginning to understand what that friendship would require, and he was beginning to understand why the communities that had cultivated it for 1,000 years were still standing after every typhoon that came, while the walls went up and came down around them, while the models changed and the infrastructure aged, and the sea levels rose and the storm systems intensified, while the river rose and fell, as it had always done and always would do. The friendship held, the Baha held, the community held. Some flood management is built from concrete, some is built from computational models, and some, the flood management that has been keeping a Pampanga community dry in the inhabited areas for 1,000 typhoon seasons without a single meter of Dutch standard infrastructure, is built from the specific, patient, generationally accumulated friendship between a people and their river that produces, in time, a system of water wisdom that no engineering school has ever been large enough to teach. The Netherlands came to Pampanga to assess an adaptation education. It found instead a 1,000-year engineering tradition whose results it had been trying to achieve for 5 centuries. The water had known the way the whole time. Tatay Goryo had simply been listening. Every island holds a secret. Every barangay has a legend. Subscribe and stay close. Next, we uncover the story of a Finnish education expert who called Filipino teachers unqualified, and what happened in that classroom changed his entire career. Tell us in the comments, which Filipino legend should we unearth next?